The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the quiet, marshy banks of the Alle River. For weeks, two mighty empires had stalked each other through the vast expanse of Eastern Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, the towering figure of Europe's new order, was poised for another decisive blow against the Russian Empire. The year was 1807, and the fields outside the town of Friedland would soon be soaked with blood. For here, Napoleon would unleash the full power of his Grande Armée against an enemy that dared to challenge his dominance. It was a battlefield where the Russian army's hopes for stopping Napoleon's relentless expansion would be shattered, and a new European order would begin to emerge. Napoleon Bonaparte, already a legend for his military brilliance, had been embroiled in the grueling conflicts of the War of the Fourth Coalition. France had fought a series of fierce battles against Prussia, Russia, and their allies. The French Emperor had already delivered devastating blows to Prussia in 1806 at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, leaving the once mighty Prussian army in ruins. With Prussia crippled, Russia remained Napoleon's primary adversary on the European continent. The Tsar's armies were formidable, but they had yet to meet Napoleon in full force. After months of manoeuvring and smaller skirmishes, the two great powers were on the verge of a clash that would determine the fate of Europe for years to come. By June 1807, Russian forces under General Bennigsen were exhausted after months of grueling campaigns. They had clashed with Napoleon's forces at the Battle of Eylau earlier that year, a brutal and inconclusive winter battle fought in blinding snowstorms, which left tens of thousands dead, but no clear victor. Despite the heavy losses on both sides, Napoleon maintained the strategic advantage and continued to pursue the Russian army. General Bennigsen, desperate to halt Napoleon's momentum and in need of a decisive victory, decided to make his stand at Friedland, a small town on the Alle River. Friedland was not an ideal position for Bennigsen to defend, but he hoped that the terrain and the river would give his forces an edge. The town sat on the western bank of the river, with only a few bridges offering access for retreat. The area was marshy and broken by forests, which Bennigsen believed would make it difficult for the French to launch a coordinated assault. However, this also meant that if his army were forced to retreat, they would be trapped between the advancing French forces and the river, a perilous situation that Napoleon was quick to exploit. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, saw the vulnerability in Bennigsen's position. He had learned from his scouts that the Russian forces were spread out, with their back to the river, creating a dangerous bottleneck. Napoleon's plan was simple but brilliant: draw the Russians into battle, pin them against the Alle River, and then deliver a crushing blow that would leave no room for escape. It was a classic Napoleonic tactic: lure the enemy into a vulnerable position and then strike with overwhelming force. In the early hours of June 14, 1807, Napoleon began to implement his plan. His forces, totaling around 80,000 men, began their advance on Friedland. Marshal Lannes, commanding the French vanguard, engaged the Russians in a series of skirmishes to hold their attention and keep them from realizing the full scale of the French build-up. For several hours, the fighting was light and inconclusive, with both sides testing each other's strength. As the morning wore on, the Russians grew more confident that they could hold their position. Bennigsen, believing he had the advantage, ordered his troops to cross the river and launch a full-scale attack on the French forces. This would prove to be his critical mistake. By moving his army forward, Bennigsen exposed his flanks and overextended his lines, exactly what Napoleon had been waiting for. At midday, with the Russians fully committed, Napoleon unleashed the full strength of the Grande Armée. He ordered Marshal Ney to launch a massive assault on the Russian left flank, supported by artillery barrages from the French batteries positioned on higher ground. Ney, known for his ferocity in battle, led the charge with his characteristic boldness. His troops, Seasoned veterans of many campaigns moved with precision and speed, overwhelming the Russian forces and driving them back toward the river. The battle now began to shift decisively in favor of the French. Napoleon, positioned at a vantage point overlooking the battlefield, watched as his plan unfolded perfectly. He directed Marshal Victor and Marshal Mortier to press the attack on the Russian centre and right, further stretching Bennigsen's lines and cutting off any possibility of retreat. The French artillery continued to pound the Russian positions, inflicting heavy casualties and spreading confusion among the ranks. As the afternoon wore on, the Russian army found itself increasingly hemmed in by the advancing French forces. Bennigsen's troops were now fighting with their backs to the Alle River, and their situation grew more desperate by the minute. Russian soldiers, realizing that there was no escape, began to panic. The narrow bridges across the river became choke points as men tried to flee, and many drowned in the river's swift currents or were cut down by the relentless French cavalry commanded by Marshal Murat. The Russian army was being crushed from all sides, and Bennigsen had no choice but to order a retreat, one that quickly turned into a chaotic rout. Napoleon, sensing total victory, ordered his forces to pursue the fleeing Russians. The French cavalry, led by Murat, charged through the disorganized Russian lines, cutting down stragglers and capturing thousands of prisoners. By nightfall, the Russian army had been utterly defeated. Over 20,000 Russian soldiers lay dead or wounded on the battlefield, and thousands more had been taken prisoner. The French, by contrast, had suffered relatively light casualties, a testament to Napoleon's skillful execution of his battle plan. The Battle of Friedland was one of Napoleon's most brilliant victories. It was not just a tactical triumph, but a strategic one as well. With the Russian army in tatters, Tsar Alexander I had no choice but to seek peace with Napoleon. The French emperor had decisively broken the back of the Fourth Coalition, leaving only Britain as his main adversary in Europe. In the aftermath of Friedland, the two emperors, Napoleon and Alexander, met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River to negotiate the terms of peace. The resulting Treaty of Tilsit, signed in July 1807, marked a turning point in European politics. Under the treaty, Russia agreed to ally with France against Britain and withdrew from the war. Prussia, which had been Napoleon's enemy in the coalition, was forced to cede large territories and was reduced to a shadow of its former self. For Napoleon, the Treaty of Tilsit was a diplomatic masterpiece. It allowed him to reshape the map of Europe to his advantage and temporarily secure peace on the continent. He created the Duchy of Warsaw from Prussian-held Polish territories, establishing a new French-aligned state in Eastern Europe. Moreover, Napoleon now had the opportunity to turn his attention to Britain, his last remaining enemy, and enforce the continental system, a blockade designed to isolate Britain economically. However, the peace forged at Tilsit would not last. Though Napoleon and Alexander appeared to reach a cordial understanding, their alliance was fragile. Over the next few years, tensions between France and Russia would simmer, particularly over the enforcement of the continental system and Napoleon's ambitions in Eastern Europe. The seeds of future conflict were sown at Tilsit, and within 5 years the two emperors would once again be at war. The Battle of Friedland was a defining moment in the Napoleonic Wars. It demonstrated Napoleon's unparalleled ability to outmaneuver and outthink his enemies on the battlefield. It also underscored the fragility of the alliances formed against him. While Friedland cemented Napoleon's dominance over Europe, it also marked the beginning of the end for his empire. The peace with Russia was temporary, and the conflicts that would follow would ultimately lead to his downfall. As the sun set over the blood-soaked fields of Friedland on that fateful day in June 1807, Napoleon stood at the height of his power. Yet, even as he savoured his victory, the forces that would eventually bring him down were already stirring. For now, however, Europe lay at his feet, and the world would remember the Battle of Friedland as one of the greatest triumphs of the Emperor of France.